he tells me, there we go. He tells me he's going to be fairly busy in another level here with St. Thomas over the next few months. So anyway, I'm going to turn things over to our speaker. And once Dr. Boudreau is over, we'll stop the recording and we will have some time for Q&A. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Greg, for the invitation. Thank you, everyone, for attending, especially on a beautiful Tuesday evening. So I appreciate that very much. And I will do my best not to bore everyone, but if I do, at least it'll allow you to fall asleep more easily this evening. So this is, of course, the part of the shameless self-promotion portion of this talk. This paper is sort of a preliminary dive into this case, the executions of George and Rufus Hamilton in Fredericton in 1949. It's one important piece of a much larger project that's looking at executions in New Brunswick between 1869 and 1957. There were, over that period, in New Brunswick, there were 26 men who were executed during that time period, no women. And thus I've done a few blogs on some of these cases. And the one that I've done the most work on is the 1923 botched execution of Benny Swim in Woodstock, New Brunswick. I have two published articles on the Benny Swim, one in the Journal of New Brunswick Studies, which appeared in 2020. And the Journal of New Brunswick Studies is an open access journal, so please feel free to peruse. It's a wonderful journal. I'm biased because I'm the editor, but nonetheless, even if I wasn't the editor, it is still a great journal. And two of our colleagues here tonight, Dr. Huskins and Dr. Silverjoe, are members of the editorial board. And I have a second article on Benny Swim coming out next month or the month after in Acadiensis, the Journal of the History of the Atlantic region. So do look for those, please. So without further ado, the title of the paper tonight, and I'm hoping that in one sense, this again is a preliminary dive into this case, that I hope that it's at some point, this is a paper that I will be submitting for publication, ideally to perhaps the Canadian Historical Review. So that's my hope. But a tragic drama of murder and racial identity, the executions of George and Rufus Hamilton in Fredericton, New Brunswick. Now, I do not have many, well, I only have one image, which I will share fairly soon. Unfortunately, the images that exist for George and Rufus Hamilton are primarily from newspapers, and they're grainy and haven't reproduced very well. But nonetheless, I will be digging around for more of those images. Plus, I'm happy in part of the question and answer period to talk about the sources that I've used for this case as well. So, $427.50. That was the fee that Camille Brachon, the quote-unquote high executioner for Quebec, charged E.M. Lyons, who was the sheriff of York County, for conducting the executions of George and Rufus Hamilton. The actual hangings, and it's important to note that hanging was the only method of execution that Canada used in the post-Confederation era. The actual hangings themselves were each cost $150 plus expenses. And this was comparable to what other executioners charged for their services. This cost of $427.50 was easily justified by the state to ensure that quote unquote justice for the victim, his family, and society was served. So my hope is to share with you this one image, if I may, of the invoice. This is the invoice that was submitted. So you can see he charged almost for everything. Taxi from home to the station in Montreal, $350, the railway fare, Pullman on the train, meals, taxi, hotel in Fredericton, $36.35. And then even charged for helping to construct the scaffold, 2 ropes, the black bonnets for the hangings, which he placed over their heads, a jar of Vaseline, and the hangings themselves, $150, miscellaneous, tips, etc., $427.50. This basically was what George and Rufus Hamilton's lives and death were. So I can come back to that image as well. So the executions of George and Rufus Hamilton in Fredericton in July of 1949, I think, underscore Constance Packhouse's assertion that the legal system, quote, played a principal and dominant role in creating and preserving racial discrimination. These men lived on the margins of society due to their poverty and a lack of formal education. Moreover, their quote unquote Negro racial extraction compounded their marginalization in what was a predominantly white community. Similarly, being of quote Negro racial extraction meant that in the eyes of many Fredericton residents, the leap from committing petty crime to murder was, while shocking, also understandable, if not inevitable. Indeed, many Canadians believed that Blacks, especially Black men, were prone to violence and immorality and were intellectually inferior. As George Eliot Clark has noted, racialized murderers were seen to represent inferior cultures. Ultimately, it was determined that the lives of these men were not worth saving, and so the law was permitted to take its course. Because all capital cases in Canada were reviewed by the federal cabinet to see if their death sentences were to be commuted. And that of course, did not happen in this case. Their executions also represented, some have argued, a 20th century version of lynching by the state. For as Michael J. Pfeiffer has posited, when examining lynchings in American society between 1874 and 1947, quote, lynching came from the early modern death penalty, and the modern death penalty came from lynching. Now, their small numbers in ethnic identity meant that minorities did not attain any substantial degree of socioeconomic power in Fredericton specifically and New Brunswick generally. Consequently, they were susceptible to hostility and discrimination from many sectors of white society, notably the criminal justice system. Black Canadians, Indigenous peoples, and quote unquote foreigners, as they were referred to, waged an ongoing battle against racial discrimination throughout the 20th century. In most cases, racial animosity manifested itself not in violent acts necessarily, but in subtler forms of rejection, one of which was ethnic stereotyping. In the country's efforts to combat crime and maintain the socioeconomic status quo through an adherence to law and order, police officers, judges, and many white residents associated particular criminal acts with specific minority groups. Black Canadians and quote unquote foreigners were perceived to possess a propensity for violence and an uncontrollable urge to break the law. Underlying these assumptions about the criminal intent of visible minorities was the belief that they posed a threat to white social order. The public fear associated with ethnic stereotypes had much to do with the socially constructed racial identities conferred upon minorities. Indeed, it's been argued that precisely because, quote unquote, race is given meaning through the agency of human beings and social contexts and is not a biological or natural category, it was and is perhaps a potent ideology. In Canada, for much of the 20th century, a process of quote unquote racialization flourished. Essentially, racialization denotes a willingness on the part of a dominant class to identify skin color, language, birthplace, and cultural practices as markers of distinction. In other words, to depict those who do not belong to the racial majority as the other. For Black residents of Fredericton, this meant that they were accorded marginal status within the city. This marginalization manifested itself in part in the tendency by members of the majority ethnic group to equate the other with criminality. George Eliot Clark has argued that by blaming minorities for crime and immorality, white Canadians could maintain that crime was un-Canadian and that the criminal was therefore, quote unquote, alien. Many citizens perceived these aliens as more likely than members of their own ethnic group to inhabit a criminal underworld. Although not seen as the only members of this clique, minorities joined prostitutes, vagrants, and quote unquote miscreants in this imagined criminal underworld. Thus, as was the case in other Canadian cities, the inclination to blame the prevalence of crime and vice on ethnic minorities surfaced in Fredericton. This provided the police with a specific group of suspects to apprehend, and it reinforced the view that crime and criminals epitomized everything that law-abiding citizens believed to be reprehensible and incompatible with a traditional, ordered way of life in New Brunswick's capital. Bad characters, that is what George and Rufus Hamilton were described as. The execution of George and Rufus Hamilton on July 26, 1949, at the York County Jail in Fredericton for the murder of a white taxi driver, Norman Burgoyne, was considered by many to be a just conclusion to what the police had described as a, quote, one of the most brutal murders in the province's history. This, of course, was the last execution that occurred in the city of Stately Elms. The city's previous hanging occurred in 1925 when Henry D. Williams, age 37, was executed for the rape and murder of his half-niece, Cynthia Foster, who was aged 14. That is a case for another day, but it too was a gruesome case. The press depicted the 34-year-old Burgoyne as a model of respectability. He was a lifelong resident of Fredericton, a veteran, a devoted husband of 11 years, a loving father of 3 young children, and a successful businessman. Indeed, he was owner-operator of Burgoyne's Taxi. Burgoyne's battered body was discovered locked in the trunk of his taxi on a lonely woods road beyond the Fredericton city limits on Monday, January 10th, 1949, 2 days after he had gone missing. Following a brief investigation and a tip from a witness who had informed the RCMP that George and Rufus were seen driving a car that resembled Burgoyne's taxi, the Hamilton brothers were arrested on January 16th and held in custody until their trials began in May. E.B. McClatchy, Esquire, who was the Deputy Attorney General, and Edward J. Hughes, Esquire, represented the Crown, while Rufus Hamilton was defended by John A. Warner, Esquire. I aspire to be referred to as Esquire. You don't have to refer to me as Esquire this evening, however. And counsel and John A. Warner, Esquire, was a quote-unquote junior barrister, and counsel for George Hamilton was Leo F. Kane. So 2 seasoned prosecutors, 2 relatively junior defense attorneys. George and Rufus Hamilton lived both physically and economically on the margins of Fredericton society. George, aged 23, resided with his wife and 2 infant children, one of whom was born just days before his arrest, in a small 2-room house with no running water in the quote-unquote Negro settlement at Barker's Point on the north side of the city. Now, according to the 1941 census, New Brunswick was home to 1,254 Black residents. York County, which of course included Fredericton, had 294 Black residents, or 23% of the total Black population in the province. And the province's Fredericton's population in 1941 was 10,062. By 1951, it was 16,018. George, who had only a grade 3 education, did not have stable employment. In his own words, he, quote, worked off and on. And by his own admission, he survived at times by gambling. Quote, I have made quite a bit of money gambling. Rufus, age 22, held a series of menial jobs, and before he came to live with his brother in late 1948, he had been incarcerated for 2 years at Dorchester Penitentiary for committing robbery with violence. The trial judge, Chief Justice J.E. Michaud, in his charge to the jury, described George and Rufus as, quote, bad characters. To put it in common parlance, I would say bad eggs, unquote. Both men desperately needed money and devised a scheme to travel to downtown Fredericton and, in their words, bump someone, drag them into an alley and rob them. But George soon surmised that this was a risky proposition, especially in broad daylight. So instead, he suggested that once he and Rufus arrived downtown, they call a cab, have the driver take them to a quote unquote lonely place, and then knock him unconscious and take his money. On Friday, January 7th, 1949, the Hamilton brothers took a bus from the Barker's Point to the city's south side, called a taxi from a payphone, and requested that they be picked up at the Legion on Queen Street. That building is no longer there. I think they're building quote unquote luxury apartments there. When Norman Burgoyne arrived to pick them up, however, George, who recognized Burgoyne, apparently had second thoughts about their plan. At Rufus's trial, George admitted on the witness stand that, quote, I had the intention in my heart to get some money. I had that in my own heart because I was squeezed, unquote. But George insisted that, quote, when I seen it was Norman Burgoyne, I was scared and never did it. If it had been someone else turned up, would it have been the same thing? I don't know, unquote. And it is important to note that George Hamilton testified at Rufus's trial, and indeed arguably testified against Rufus. Now, despite George's trepidation, he and Rufus climbed into Burgoyne's taxi and asked him to take them to a bootlegger. After driving to various places, Rufus was growing impatient with George's resistance to carry out their plan. So, when they stopped at Nat McIntyre's home and George went to see about purchasing some, quote, home brew, Rufus took the hammer that George had brought with him and hit Burgoyne twice on the head. When George returned to the cab, he found Norman Burgoyne's body slouched over in the front passenger seat. And when he asked Rufus what had happened, Rufus allegedly said, quote, you lost your nerve, so I hit the son of a bitch. I didn't want to go home without some cash, unquote. The provincial pathologist, Dr. McKean, discovered 2 lacerations on the right side of Burgoyne's head, and his skull was collapsed into his brain. Dr. McKean concluded that Norman Burgoyne had died from a loss of blood and the blows that he had suffered to his head. A key issue at their trials was whether the Hamilton brothers intended to kill Norman Burgoyne. As an RCMP report from June of 1949 noted, the evidence, quote, clearly indicates that robbery was premeditated, but it is difficult to determine whether murder was premeditated or whether murder resulted from the carrying out of the robbery plot, unquote. Given, of course, the outcome of this case, the jury was convinced that indeed the murder was intended, at least on Rufus's part, but as an accomplice, George also suffered the outcome. Now, it was later revealed at trial that George and Rufus had divided Burgoyne's cash evenly between them, about $83 each. They also took Burgoyne's Rolex watch and his ring, but they threw his rosary into the woods. Over the course of the weekend, this is now back in January, they used the money to purchase alcohol, food, clothes, and they paid off a few debts. This, coupled with the fact that the Hamilton brothers drove Burgoyne's taxi, described by one newspaper as the quote unquote death car, they drove the taxi with Burgoyne's body in the trunk. They drove it to Minto and then later to St. John with his body still in the trunk. This did not endear them well in the eyes of many Fredericton residents or the jury. As the Daily Gleaner described it, this was, quote, the most deliberately planned and brutally executed capital crime in the history of this provincial capital. Moreover, Rufus had apparently said to some of George's neighbors the next day that, quote, I think we killed a man, unquote. The racial overtones in this case were numerous. George and Rufus were usually described in the press as the, quote, Negro brothers, the colored brothers, or the Barker's Point Negroes, unquote. And Barker's Point itself was later nicknamed Hammertown. Moreover, in his report to what was officially known as the Secretary of State for Canada, and this was part of the review process. So as I mentioned earlier, all capital cases were automatically reviewed by the federal cabinet to determine whether or not the death sentence could be commuted. And part of what the cabinet took into consideration was a report from the trial judge. So in his report to the federal government, Chief Justice Michaud noted that Rufus had purchased a large quantity of liquor on Saturday, which led to a, quote, good drinking party for the rest of the day. The neighbors were invited, and apparently the whole of the Negro settlement had a merry afternoon, unquote. Now, in addition to infantilizing the members of Fredericton's Black community, Michaud's statement implied that they were indifferent to the murder of a white resident of the city. And Michaud concluded that the federal government should show no mercy upon George and Rufus Hamilton, that the law, execution, should take its course. There were also more subtle signs of racism that Black residents in Fredericton faced. When questioned by the Crown why he abandoned the taxi outside of Fredericton rather than bringing it back into the city, George replied that he knew that he could not return to the city in Burgoyne's taxi, which was a black Ford sedan. Quote, and this is George, I was scared to death to come up to the city of Fredericton, unquote, because many people would indeed have been suspicious of a Black man driving a quote unquote big car. George believed that as a member of a racialized minority, his every move would garner a degree of suspicion and surveillance. In essence, George Hamilton, I believe, was keenly aware of his place as the other in New Brunswick's capital. He knew he would have drawn attention to himself by driving in a, quote, big car as a Black man in Fredericton. George Hamilton, and this sense of his place in Fredericton society and the subtle and not so subtle racism and surveillance that he would have come under, I think may have also been informed to George Hamilton because of another racist incident amongst many, but I'll just focus on one for this evening, that occurred in Fredericton a few years prior to his execution. In late November and early December of 1947, it was reported that students at UNB had planned to boycott 4 barbershops in Fredericton after it was alleged that 3 Black students, 2 of whom were veterans of the Second World War, were refused service because of the color of their skin. 500 UNB students signed a petition to protest this racial discrimination, and they vowed to open a barbershop on campus that served everyone. The editor-in-chief of the student newspaper, the Brunswickan, denounced this act of racial discrimination against Black residents of the city, refusing them service. Quote, the same fine citizens of Fredericton who contribute large sums to Christianize the poor heathen, who are considered to be solid pillars of our churches, but who refuse to sit in a barber's chair after a Negro has had his hair cut there, are no more Christians in the true sense of the word than the heathen they want to convert, unquote. When the Daily Gleaner later asked the barbershop owners, quote, "Do you think that the majority of the people in the city are prejudiced racially?" unquote, their reply was that, quote, "most say no," unquote. The key word, of course, in their response being most. Most say no, not all say no. In other words, the barbershop owners had perhaps their finger on the pulse, at least of their clients, some of whom were not comfortable sitting beside a Black member of the community or even being in the same business or as a member of the Black community. In a stinging rebuke of Fredericton's subtle and not so subtle racism, Fred Cogswell, who many of you no doubt know, was one of the so-called Confederation poets, penned Ode to Fredericton. "White are your housetops, white too the vaunted elms, that make your stately streets long aisles of prayer, and white your 13 spires that point to God, who reigns afar in pure and whiter air, and white the dome of your democracy. The snow has pitied you and made you fair. Oh, snow-washed city of cold, white Christians, so white you will not cut a Black man's hair," unquote. That's Fred Cogswell's Ode to Fredericton. The jury, in these cases, which was comprised of men of, quote, "of superior intelligence," unquote, in other words, superior intelligence, and they were all white men, it should be noted, and they were of so-called superior intelligence, superior to that of a Black man, took only 50 minutes to deliver a guilty verdict with no recommendation for mercy, thus bringing this tragic drama, as the trial judge described the case, to a close. Now, the 50 minutes isn't necessarily surprising. In many of the cases that I've looked at, the juries did not deliberate for days or weeks, which we sometimes see now. Indeed, in some cases, the jury would deliberate, literally, I've seen them deliberate 15, 20 minutes and come back with a guilty verdict. So in one sense, 50 minutes was a long time. What was interesting, though, about this guilty verdict is no recommendation for mercy. In most capital cases that I've examined, both in New Brunswick and elsewhere in Canada, juries would come in with a guilty verdict, yes, but with a recommendation for mercy. It's been argued in part they did this to, in some cases, relieve themselves of the guilt that some may have felt about sentencing someone to their death. However, in cases where there were ethnic minorities or Indigenous peoples who were found guilty of a capital offense, rarely did their juries recommend mercy. So there is a pattern there. In a journal that he had kept in the 2 months prior to his execution, George recorded that he watched a group of men, including the high executioner, construct the gallows, which must have been an eerie feeling to actually watch out of your window of your cell the men constructing your death machine. But in this journal, he also seemed to be at peace, as he wrote, all in capital letters, quote, "I am not afraid to die." And he was not afraid to die, George wrote, because he believed that Jesus loved him. The crowd that had assembled outside the jail cheered as George and Rufus Hamilton were led to the gallows, reminiscent, I would argue, of the boisterous spirit that was evident in many 19th century public executions and lynchings. According to the Daily Gleaner, George and Rufus Hamilton's execution, which occurred at 2 a.m., but yet it drew a crowd, attracted hundreds of curious onlookers from the city and the surrounding communities. Quote, "Every adjacent rooftop, line fence, window, and woodpile were at a premium," the Gleaner reported, as the crowd, quote, "which ranged from babes in arms to graybeards, choked the entrance to the gaol yard and vantage points for a glimpse of the condemned Negroes, unquote. And this, of course, is a fascinating element that even though Canada had long, prior to 1949, had long abolished public executions, they were still in some cases public because they were often held, even though they were held in some cases at 5 a.m. or in this case 2 a.m., they were still held in the courtyards of local jails, or gaols as they were often referred to. And so people could still watch. Yes, individuals were invited to attend the actual ceremony, usually the sheriff, a doctor, and sometimes people from the media. But as the 20th century progressed, the media was less and less invited to these events, because if things went wrong, authorities didn't want a firsthand account of these executions. So yes, were these executions private? In practice, or in theory, yes. In practice, I would argue no, that they were still witnessed by, in some cases, hundreds of people, which happened for George and Rufus. And they were executed, by the way, together, back to back. After George and Rufus Hamilton were declared dead, their passing was, quote, heralded by the tolling of the St. Dunstan's Roman Catholic Church bell, which of course is located across the street from the jail. As a headline in the St. John Telegraph Journal proclaimed, quote, Negro brothers pay for murder of N.P. Burgoyne. So to conclude, and again, this is a very high level look at all of this, and happy to expand on many things. I can suck the virtual air out of any room, and whether it be a physical room or a virtual room. The belief that the execution of George and Rufus Hamilton was a fitting end to this crime was echoed in an editorial that appeared within days of their hanging, noting that Norman Burgoyne's murder was, quote, planned and carried out with extraordinary callousness. The Telegraph Journal hoped that the Hamilton brothers' fate would, quote, act as a warning to any of like mind. Now, this sentiment, I think, underscores the fact that capital punishment was still viewed by some Canadians as a necessary form of deterrence, which may in part explain Canadians' continued support for the death penalty in the 1940s and early 1950s. In 1943, for example, 73% of Canadians who were surveyed were in favor of capital punishment, while in 1953, 71% supported it. Now, the murder of Norman Burgoyne, I think, shattered Fredericton's self-constructed image of tranquil whiteness and exposed its not so polite racism and perhaps seething desire for revenge, which was cloaked in a veneer of, quote unquote, justice. And while the Hamilton case is unique in the context of executions in 20th century New Brunswick, mainly for its racial overtones, it is similar to other cases in Canada in terms of the swift and harsh punishment that was handed down to Black men who were found guilty of murdering white men, women, or children. And if the motive in these cases was robbery, then Black Canadians were almost guaranteed to be executed. In the period alone from 1946 to 1967, 5 Black Canadians were executed, of course, 2 of whom were George and Rufus, and 4 of these cases were found to have been motivated by robbery. Many residents of Fredericton prided themselves on living in a city that was respectable because it was white. In this conception of the provincial capital, little room could be found for Black people, since most were considered to be deviants and criminals. And the fact that most Black peoples in Fredericton lived in a separate community only added to their isolation and the shroud of suspicion around their lives and actions. Similarly, I think this case highlights the power of the law to, quote, reinforce racial difference as a social fact. The trial of George and Rufus Hamilton was permeated with racialized overtones, and their quote unquote otherness ensured that their executions were indeed considered to be an appropriate conclusion to this tragic drama. David Garland, I think, has astutely noted that the criminal punishment, and racial oppression are a quote unquote linked couplet, which means that the criminal justice system, in both its formal executions and informal lynchings, iterations, has been used to keep Black Canadians in their place. And executions, which is the ultimate form of punishment that the government could inflict on criminals, was for Blacks akin to lynchings, and thus a way for society to deal with the allegorical figure of the quote unquote dangerous Black man. So I think that for now is all I have, but there's so much more. Again, this is a very high-level view of this case. There's so much more that I could touch upon. There's still so much more that I still have to research and extrapolate from and reconsider. And indeed, I'm hoping that tonight, part of that reconsideration or reconsidering will be some of your comments and feedback. So please feel free to ask away, criticize. Oh yes, I should mention that, and I'm sure all of you are aware, but I'll say it anyway. George Eliot Clarke has written a novel based on this case, George and Rue, and what I think is a riveting collection of poems entitled The Execution Poems, published by Gaspereau Press. I encourage you to read both because they are excellent. Especially, I'm particularly fond of his collection of poems, execution poems. There's one line that very poignant line in the poems that I didn't use now, but I'm going to use, that he says, quote, "My black face prefaces murder to you," unquote. And of course, by the my, he's in the poems, he is taking on the voice of George and Rufus Hamilton, and my black face is theirs, and prefaces murder to you, meaning to the white community. So very powerful, and I encourage all of you to, if you haven't read them, to please do.